We come to a propitious date. This is 1-4-14. As my daughter used to say, these are magic numbers. They pair, but they pair in such a way that there are three rather than just two. This 2014 series is, the title of it is Parayana. And you can put the article "the" in if you like, the Parayana. And the Parayana is something which now is being introduced for the first time, so it is new. It is now new, has begun its emergence today with this presentation. But it also, because of a particular pairing of the future and the new past, it has a recursive quality of going back to the origins of the testimony of an ancient wisdom tradition. And that ancient wisdom tradition happened about 2,500 years ago. And in this particular lead into it, it originates with the historical Buddha. When the historical Buddha, who lived 80 years, when he passed on, one doesn't say he died, but the traditional word for what happened was the parinirvana. The parinirvana was his ascension from the release of the bodily form into his eternal Buddha nature, as it were. And that this Buddha nature is eternal, but has the ability to come into a reincarnation, except that a Buddha does not reincarnate so much, but characterizes a new age, a new time form. And in ancient India, time forms were immense. The Yuga was something like 100 million years, and it is something which is cosmic, has nothing to do with material universes, has everything to do with a cosmos that is pulsing with periodicities, with miracles, with incredible exactitude, and all of this was characterized as there have been previous Buddhas, but this Buddha is not the reincarnation of some previous Buddha, but is a fresh incarnation that has a background, as they say, of enormous lives as various kinds of animals and other kinds of people, who the traditional collection of the tales of the previous lives of the Buddha are collected. They make 3 thick volumes called the Jataka Tales, translated in 6 volumes, 3 volumes of text and 3 volumes of translation by E.B. Cowell in the 19th century, and still in print from the sacred books of the Buddhists. The Jataka Tales are 550 lives when the Buddha was a monkey, when he was a horse, when he was this person, he was that person, male and female, and all of these previous lives had an accumulation of dedication that was built up through travail and through disappointments and through incredible tragedies, catastrophes, beautiful recoveries and emergences, and eventually the historical Buddha became something of a figure of someone who achieved, not under a single Bodhi tree, but under 4 trees, the great banyan tree, the several other kinds of trees, and the 4th one was the Bodhi tree. It's a kind of an Indian fig or ficus tree. His parinirvana occurred in 483 BC, and at the time there was great sorrow. I'll bring in a print perhaps next week of a classic, everyone is weeping, the animals are weeping, everyone is down, the monks are down, and in order to bring that back into its reality, there was a confabulation of all of the members of his Sangha, all of the monks that were with him in that Sangha, in that community. And there were also some nuns. There were many lay persons. And they were brought together near a peak, Vulture Peak, in northern India, but in the southernmost tip of the Buddha's living ambit, from Kusinara and up near where Nepal is, all the way down below the Ganges, near Patna, near Benares, at Rajagriha. And there, in that confab, those who had heard the Buddha recited the remembered sutras. And at this time, there was an enormous quality of excellence that happened. The later development, some 500 years later, almost 600 years later, where the old way, it was called the way of the elders, the Theravada. Vada is a path. The elders' path was the Theravada. And at that time, all of the sutras were remembered. And there were many small sutras, and there were some that were quite tiny. There were some that were beginning to be a little more substantial. And all of them were the short sutras. The Sanskrit word for short is kula. Then there were the middle length sutras, the Majjhima Nikaya, and they were 150, actually 151, but 150, and they were grouped in groups of 10, and 15 of these groups of 10 made up the middle length sayings, as the original translation in the Polytext Society was by Miss I.B. Horner. And in order to show that the 10 was a set that then had a capacity to have a perfection, a perfect 10, at the end of each 10, that particular short sutra would become something that was like a mnemonic cue that this set is now complete, and if there is another set, it begins as a resonance of this first set. So when one looks at the middle length sayings, the Majjhima Nikaya, a Nikaya is like the ability to have something that is sutra remembered, collected together. And in the 10th of the Majjhima Nikaya, you have the Satipatthana Sutra. And Satipatthana is world famous as the mindfulness sutra, that one learns by the presentation, the teaching, almost like an instruction, that this is a vipassana. Actually, the Sanskrit term is vipassana. It is the way of mindfulness. It is the paying of attention continuously. And when one does this continuously, what occurs when you become not just efficient at it, not even further proficient at it, when you are absorbed within it, that continuity obviates the separations of space. And it eventually obviates even the dimension of time, so that there is a continuity of timelessness. And in that continuity of timelessness, anything that occurs spontaneously. It emerges spontaneously and it absorbs spontaneously, so that it can go in and out of existence in such a way that when it emerges into existence, the characteristic of its structure, of its power to be, is that it is at the root paired. So that symmetry is the root of the universe. But the continuity of formlessness is the reality of the cosmos. So it is going in and out of this, and in about 90 AD, because the Theravada had, after 500 years, achieved, according to one of the prophetic predictions of the Buddha, that after 500 years there would come someone to refine everything that had been done. What would the refining be? The refining would be that the nirvana was the perfection of the pairedness, which then, in its perfection, would be able to, en masse, ensemble, return to formlessness and to reality. And so at that time in India, there was a monumental, which is too small a word. It was epochable, which is also too small a word. There was a change of time form that had occurred and was brought into India from outside. And the messenger of that was St. Thomas. St. Thomas, Thomas is identified in the New Testament as Didymus Thomas, the twin. That is to say, he was like a twin to Jesus, not in the sense that they particularly looked alike. In fact, they didn't look alike, but that he was paired in attunement to Jesus in such that one then understood the phrase doubting Thomas is not the doubting of Jesus, but the doubting of the risen Jesus as being parable to him. And he didn't feel the parability to the risen Jesus. And when he discovered that there was a particular newness, that the risen Jesus was in fact an eternal emergence, and that the living Jesus had been someone that one could be paired to, the returned, risen Jesus was only someone that could be shared with. So that pairing is at the deepest quality of the universe and shows itself in symmetries, the predilection for symmetries, and for pairs to pair and become squares, become quaternaries, and for the quaternaries, the squares, to take that inheritance, and two squares can pair together and make an octagonal, an octagonal, an octet, an octave. And so one begins to see that the eights are enormously important as a structure of paired squares of attention. That the attentiveness that is there in vipassana, in the vipassana, in the way of mindfulness, that mindfulness becomes full even to the extent that it is absorbed in the mind's absorption into the real. And while pairedness is the core of what has emerged into existence, positive and negative, proton and electron, etc., there are qualities of formlessness that are real. And their reality, is not discernible in the universe at all, because it doesn't have a pairedness. It has, in lieu of pairedness, sharedness. So that the shared quality of presence is, as we would say in a paired universe, the characteristic of reality. And the reality of the risen Jesus was able to spontaneously share with Thomas and many of the others who were there, so that they became in shared presence with that eternal quality. And Thomas took that to India, and he took it to 3 different places in India. The first was in South India, what is Kerala province today. And it was where the ancient trade routes from Egypt contacted because of the pre-monsoon wind season that allowed one to sail from the Yemen-Ethiopian coast, Yemen-Somalia coast, from Socotra Island that is there at the mouth of the Red Sea as it opens up. The first person to take advantage of those sailing conditions that led directly to the South India tip, to where Kerala is, that Malabar coast, was Queen Hatshepsut, about 1500 BC in Egypt. And she was the genius behind the ability to have the Egyptian, Indian, ancient connection of civilizations that awoke Egypt and awoke India to understand that there were sophisticated human beings, men and women, of long civilized extent, who were able to come into an interface together. And the first, after the initial voyage that proved that this was the way, Queen Hatshepsut, because she was really regal, she amassed a fleet of 60 ships, and every year then at the pre-monsoon season, she would send 60 ships in a fleet from Egypt at that time extended down to Nubia, which was Egypt, and over into Yemen, and that was the ancient Sheba. And so the Queen of Sheba, 500 years after Hatshepsut, carried on the African-India relationship. And it went 2 ways, so that you would find in Ethiopia and in Yemen, in Sheba, there was a mixing of races, so that one had the Indian Africans and the Ethiopians today, the Yemenis today, have that, not a biracial quality, but a kaleidoscopic racial quality, because there are many kinds of Egyptians, many kinds of Indians. And so you had this meeting of a new quality of mankind, a new quality of humanity that emerged. in this way, Thomas landed at Kerala. Then, because the invitation, a written invitation, had come from a great king in the northern part, what is today Kashmir, what in ancient times was called Gandhara. And the Gandhara area was a recipient of many of the Greek foundations in India laid by originally Alexander the Great, but patterned on some of the early foundations laid by Cyrus the Great from Iran, from ancient Persia, really more Persia at the time than Iran. Irani is a collection of many tribes. The Persians were the ones who conquered the previous powerful tribe, the Medes, and the Persian tribe became the leadership under Cyrus the Great. And he's the first one to remember that the ancient, most ancient Semitic trade routes were those of Sargon of Akkad, about 2300 BC, some 1800 years before Cyrus, some 2,000 years before Alexander the Great, that his trading empire, because of the Semitic, North Semitic quality of being able to master many kinds of languages, not just 1, 2, and 3, dozens of languages, dozens of different qualities of culture, and to not mulch them together, but to string them like beads together on a common continuity, which was the benefit that all received from an expanded trade, and that the tone of keeping that thread of trade between hundreds of kingdoms and scores of languages, dozens of cultures, Sargon was able to show that there was a common denominator of the deeper meaning if one translated the oral spoken languages into their written forms. And so the written forms of language that began to really consolidate as something that was readable and writable became the foundation of Sargon's empire, and the genius behind that ability to use language on that scale first was Enheduanna, his prized daughter, the high priestess of the consolidation of all the Sumerian temple cities, 42 of them, together with a common thread, a common continuity, that the common denominator of all of them was a new realization now that there was a written, readable language that all could share. If you could read in any language, you could learn to read in another language. If you could write in any language, you could learn to write in any language. And so it was the common denominator of writable, readable language that eventually refined itself some 300 years later as that there were alphabetical, written, readable, writable languages that no longer needed hundreds or thousands of pictographs or odd cuneiform shapes that were almost impossible to distinguish. Now the alphabetical languages of about 2000 BC gave the ability to have certain qualities of language that became almost universal and were able to spread and displace many of the different kinds of oral languages, not in daily business, not in daily life. People still talk the way that they used to talk with each other. But in the literate populations of men and women, because they could read and they could write, they could learn to read and write someone else's language and understand, as a native then of that culture, how these intercultural qualities accrued and added up, like the many previous lives of the Buddha added finally to the emergence of a historical Buddha. That there was a quality, that one could come into play, and that one could learn not only to read and write an alphabetical language, but eventually that there were meanings. There was meaningfulness in between the lines. And it refined so that there was meaning and meaningfulness in between the words in the lines. And so a poetic of written, readable language became not something that was just remembered in a mnemonic as an instruction, but the poetic became something that was spontaneous, that came out of the pre-time limitations, the pre-space pairings, the quality that distinguished individual existence as such, and gave over the quality that one who did this had an identity, had an individuality. All of this then evaporated and melted into what could evaporate, and evaporated into what was formless and thus was real. And so this quality, about 500 years after the historical Buddha, from the risen Jesus and his shared presence with Mary Magdalene, was conveyed through St. Thomas in his shared presence, and he went to northern India, King Gondophares, who asked him to build a palace to show the population of his kingdom, which was quite powerful at the time. Gandhara was easily the same level as Egypt under Alexandria, or the Persian Empire under Antiochus. It was a major place of civilization in the world. Instead of building a physical palace, while Gondophares was out on a year's military campaigns, and when he came back, there was no palace and all the money was spent. What did you do with this royal treasure, this treasury? And Thomas said, I have distributed it to all of the people in your kingdom, and they all love you. Of course, Gondophares said, and put him into prison. But as he came to understand what had happened, the sea change of his kingdom was that everything was working beautifully. Everyone cared for each other, took care, and he began to realize that St. Thomas had built as close to a shared presence community population of his kingdom as could be possible. And so the successor who out-militarized Gondophares in Central Asia, his name was Kanishka, when he came in and took over the St. Thomistic Gondophares Gandhara, he recognized that the true root of what had happened was St. Thomas, who had passed on the baton, as it were, to a man in Gandhara named Parshva, and Parshva was giving instruction that the most outstanding critic of what was becoming the Mahayana, the great way, Jesus in his teachings as a living teaches taught the way. The risen Jesus taught the great way. And in India, when Thomas brought it through Parshva into the Mahayana, the Great Way, which was taking the historical Buddha 500 years ago, now was refined into a kaleidoscopic arrayed necklace, a garland of differential, conscious, kaleidoscopically historic, real persons that they then began to develop the Mahayana, the Great Way. And Parshva took the greatest critic of this. His name was Ashvaghosha. Asva in Sanskrit is horse. Ghosha is the sound that a whinnying horse makes, the neighing of the horse. And so the neighing of the horse is a sign of the triumphant one, the real power, the real root. It is the triumphant horse that is the carrier of the power in that age that came with the introduction. Sargon used something as a physical monetary currency in his trading empire from Cyprus to the Indus River. And the trading item that was valuable everywhere was tin. We think of tin as like, oh, tin soldier, a tin badge. But a little bit of tin goes a long way. Because when you add a little bit of tin to copper, instead of having copper, which produced the Chalcolithic age, you now had bronze. And the Bronze Age was something. A copper sword wasn't much use in battle, but a bronze sword took an edge, and you could cleave the shields, you could cleave your way. It was the real power. And so the Bronze Age that came in with Sargon seeding it, and then came in about the time that written language came in, and 1,000 years later, it had matured about 1000 BC to the age of Homer and to the age of King David, that they were contemporaries, and they were the inheritors of the power of the Bronze Age. But they were inheritors also that there was a feminine wisdom that went with the improved means that masculinity had, and that the increased wisdom of the feminine could pair with the increased means of penetration that men had developed. And together that pairing could be tunable, and be tunable until it was not unified, but until it produced a whole spectrum. And the first indication that there was a new spectrum was the five-pointed star. And it was the star that was the seed of the visionary fifth quintessential dimension that had come into play, that of differential consciousness, the thumb on the hand. And with differential consciousness as the quintessential, the whole octave now became an ability to develop something which is extraordinary. It began to have a third level. The star, the octave, ogdoad, octagonal, eightfold path, eightfold almost anything, into the real that was spontaneous through its shareability, and that the continuity of it meant that it was shareable not only now and then and there, but shareable with anyone who had ever been shareable before or will be shareable in the future, so that you had an infinite community. We're going to take a little break, and we're going to come back to Parshva's conversion of Ashvaghosha to the Mahayana. And for the first time in India, there was a written manuscript that used the term faith. In Sanskrit, faith is Shraddha. The awakening of faith in the Mahayana is one of the great classics of world literature. It is the birth of the Mahayana into a written, readable, learnable reality, which now is being put into yet another refinement. Here and now, indefinitely, the Parayana. Let's take a break. Let's come back and keep the momentum and the dynamic in its continuity. As long as one has the illusion of an identity that founds one's own individuality, time is split by your present now into a past which is more and more dead, your history, and a future which everyone is busy trying to manipulate and shape already. You're going to live in my future. As soon as that identity begins to melt, the ego, which is the puppet master, becomes a little concerned. You are damaging my ego. This is not good for me. And those who think like me, it's not good for you either. We have to stop this melting and freeze it. And we're going to freeze it completely. We're going to freeze it by keeping the ritual comportment just the way it needs to be to keep identity from eroding and melting. And what's more, we're going to get it on the other side. To keep that ritual there, we're going to have really good laws. We're going to have doctrines that are incontrovertible. And we are going to have a society that ensures that this ritual basis and this society, our identity, the protection of our egos, the sanctity of the self is going to be intact permanently. And anything that threatens us is going to be annihilated. The bombings in Volgograd just recently, case in point. By the way, Volgograd used to be called Stalingrad. And when Stalin died in 1953 and they got rid of Stalinism because it had left the Russian population mindless. If you want to know how mindless it was, it's written up by the greatest Russian poet of all time, Yevgeny Yevtushenko. When Yevtushenko came to San Francisco in 1966, everyone was astounded by the incredible courage of the man, the greatness of his poems, and that he had been raised in Siberia by third-generation political prisoners who were sent to the imprisonment. You don't need bars in Siberia. There's nowhere to go for thousands of miles. And after their children got used to, after the Second World War, that they began to feel like it was an extended Russia. It wasn't just Siberia. And the grandchildren, after post-Stalin, they began to understand that it is the Siberians who are a new refinement of species, and they're not at all like those Russians who brought in the Tsars, who brought in Lenin, who brought in Stalin, and who brought in then the sense that it is about communism. Everybody's going to have the same ideology, and everyone's going to do the same waiting in lines, and all of this then was brought into questionability and contention. And Yevtushenko, especially in his short precocious autobiography, talks about the day that Stalin died in massive Moscow hordes of crowds of people in the big squares, Red Square in front of the Kremlin. Stalin is gone. Big father. Never mind big brother. Big father. Stalin is dead. And he said, eventually the mindlessness of everyone began producing a chaotic milling of millions who were trampling people to death. And so Yevtushenko and some of the younger buddies from Siberia, they began to make human chains of locking arms and to spread the word. And it was only through the human chains of locking the arms in the hundreds of thousands of people in Red Square that brought to an end the trampling to death of people by mindlessness on a massive scale that was unbelievably vicious. Putin, responding to the bombings in ex-Stalingrad, Volgograd, said those responsible will be annihilated. Not just found, not tried, not even killed. Annihilated, which means anything associated with them, just like Stalin used to do. If you act up, everyone that knows you will be annihilated as well as you. Everything that you have done will be annihilated. And so this nihilism becomes an ideological annihilation. As William Faulkner, in his 1954 Nobel Prize speech, said, "I decline to accept the end of man. That eventually there will be a paved planet with no protrusions to endanger the flow of traffic. And you will be able to stop anywhere and be fueled with gas and oil and food and nourishment and continue on your driving way. I refuse to accept the end of man as a planet of endless parking lot for the facility of endless traffic. There is something immortal about man, which comes out in his voice, still talking. Though it be alone in a whisper, it will be heard." And the ability to hear it comes through in the ability to write it, so that someone can read it and not just hear it. And learn to read and learn to write and learn to read and write in between all kinds of lines, and the rebirth of man comes through this not being intimidated by the blue meanies and emerging out of that yellow submarine and getting the music going again, getting the dancing in the streets going again, getting the joie de vivre again. Let's come back to the birth of the Mahayana out of Buddhism, where the bodhisattvas came into play. Asvaghosha, when he begins the awakening of faith in the Mahayana. Not method, not technique, not transcendence, not nothing. The awakening of faith. Why? Because faith has a resonance that comes with charity. And charity has a harmonic that comes with hope. Faith, hope, and charity. It's a triple winner. And this is how Asvagosha begins and very quickly moves into the fives, the star seed, then moves into the eights, the octave, and then moves into the thrice greatest, the Hermes Trismegistus way of reality. This is a translation of Asvagosha by D.T. Suzuki. D.T. Suzuki was the great Zen master of the 20th century. He lived to be 96, 97 years of age. And we have appropriate fanfare for the mention of D.T. Suzuki. His given name was Tetaro Suzuki, but Daisetsu in Japanese means great humility. And so Daisetsu D.T. Suzuki, who married an English woman, Beatrice Lane, and became Beatrice Lane Suzuki, who loved cats and kimonos and loved D.T., and they lived very happily together for a long, long time. This is his translation of Asvagosha, made in Chicago, published in Chicago in 1901 by the Open Court Publishing Company. For the purpose of awakening in all beings a pure faith in the Mahayana, of destroying their doubts and attachment to false doctrines, and of affording them an uninterrupted inheritance of Buddha seeds, I write this discourse. There is a principle whereby the root of faith in the Mahayana can be produced, and I shall explain it. The explanation consists of 5 parts: the introductory, the general statement of principles, the explanation itself, the practice of faith, benefits derived therefrom, which leads then, the introductory has 8. There are 8 inducements to write this discourse. And he goes through the 8, and in the 8th, he says, in an extension of the 8th, though all these doctrines are sufficiently set forth by Asvagosha, by D.T. Suzuki's translation and commentary, set forth in the Mahayana Sutras, because by D.T. Suzuki's translation, he understood that Asvagosha's awakening of faith, that Asvagosha himself knew there would be many other sutras resonant and harmonic to his own first one. Yet as the predispositions and inclinations of people are not the same, and the conditions for obtaining enlightenment vary, I now write this discourse. But there's a third reason, which is real. There is another reason for doing so. At the time of the Tathagata, in Sanskrit, Tathata is the word for, the best English word is suchness, or in the way that in Tibetan every sutra begins with evam, and in Tibetan evam actually means thus, such, thus, thusness, suchness. The Tibetan phrase in English is from evam as the seed. is thus I have heard, meaning that the first person to ever write this down exactly heard it exactly this way. So you, in not only reading it, but if you will read it out loud, if you will lift it off the page, those within hearing distance who have ears to hear will hear this fresh, originally. Not a reproduction. It's suchness. It's thusness. At the time of the Tathagata, gata in Sanskrit means gone, means suchness gone, thusness gone, means existence has been absorbed into formlessness, which is eternally real. At the time of the Tathagata, the people were unusually gifted, and the Buddha's presence, majestic both in mind and body, served to unfold the infinite significances of the Dharma with simplicity and yet in perfection. Accordingly, there was no need for a philosophical discourse. In Sanskrit, a philosophic discourse is called a shastra. When presence shares, it is freshly real out of eternity. Not just now, but in its continuity, and as long as you don't obviate it with ego, with false individuality, with a delusional selfishness, with a illogical identity and identification as some kind of a norm against which everything must be measured and diced and filed. And after the nirvana of the Buddha, there were men who possessed in themselves the intellectual power to understand the many-sided meanings of the sutra, even if they read only a few of them. And so Ashvaghosha begins that quality, which is in an adjunct to what was current in the Theravada at that time, was the improvement of the Theravada to the Dhammapada. The Theravada, the elders' tradition, had become the truth path. And the truth path, the Dhammapada, is not in Sanskrit. It's not, especially in Sanskrit, in the Buddha's Magadhi inflection. He spoke a Magadhi form of Sanskrit in northeast India. One of the districts in the Buddha's home turf was Magadha. He was born in Lumbini, which is now in Nepal. The Dhammapada is written in Pali. Pali is the southern pronunciation of Sanskrit. It's from Ceylon. It's from Sri Lanka. It's the southern Buddhism, not of India, but into Sri Lanka, Ceylon, and across the Bay of Bengal, into Thailand, into Burma, into Southeast Asia. And so Pali became the language of the Theravada, uninterrupted by the Mahayana to a large extent. And so the monks, the Sangha of the Pali-speaking, P-A-L-I, Pali-speaking Buddhism, are literally the conservatives, but speaking in a southern dialect, almost like the die-hard southern Christians who, in their baptismal, conservative form have forgotten one of the beautiful qualities of Southern Baptism, which I'll talk about in just a moment. My father was a Southern Baptist. The conservative quality of that freeze-dries it so that no one can change an iota of the way it was written and read, and you must learn. The Masoretic text that the Rabbinic Council in Jamnia, near the coast of Israel, in 90 AD, exactly at the time that Ashvaghosha wrote The Awakening of Faith in the Mahayana, exactly at the time. Getting melodramatic because it is. That St. John wrote the Apocalypse on the Isle of Patmos. All these things happened at the same time. That the Grail was returned from the West Britain, Welsh, Irish, Southern Scottish terrain around the Irish Sea, returned back because the Grail carrier that always had to be a female of pure lineage, that female lineage, the mitochondrial DNA, was violated by kidnapping and a forced, not a marriage, not a remarriage, but a forced concubinage, and sent her husband, who was the king of the Fisher Kingdom. He was the Fisher King of the Irish Sea. And his name, in Scottish it's spelled L-E-I-R, King Lear. In English it's spelled L-E-A-R. In Welsh it's L-L-Y-R. In West Britain sometimes it was just called L-E-R, Lear. His wife's name was Penarden. She had 2 sons and a daughter. The daughter's name was Bronwyn. Her oldest son's name was Bran, or Bran. And Mani-Weedwyn, with a Y, was the second son. And when Bronwyn died of a broken heart, she was married to the King of Ireland. And whispers at his court made her an inverse Cinderella, so that instead of being the queen of the kingdom, she became the dishwasher and seamstress, mender of everyone that had to have something patched or washed. And she trained a little sparrow, an Irish sparrow, and sent it off with a message on one of its legs. And it's made its way across the Irish Sea to the Isle of Anglesey, where Bran had a part of his kingdom from Wales. There's still Bran's Hill in Wales. It still exists. And has the ruins of his ancient fort there, some almost 2,000 years ago. It's all true, folks. And when Bran led an expedition in to rescue his sister and killed many of the Irish nobles who had done this, she died of a broken heart in the north of Wales because of having been the cause of so much. And she died especially because her son had been thrown into a fire held by the feet of the nefarious one of the twins born to her by her abductor in concubinage, in order to end any kind of future for them. He threw the baby into a fire and she died of a broken heart. And that ended the Grail lineage of the women of wisdom whose mitochondrial DNA went back to Mary the Mother, intact, in the 5th generation. That grail was returned in 90 AD. And because St. John was in exile on the Isle of Patmos, it didn't stop there, but went past Ephesus, where they had come to let him know what had happened, and went on to Antioch, where the grail was put into a sheath, and the grail still exists. And as we go through the Parayana, we'll talk about where it is and why it's not even recognized anymore like anything else that is real. It is time for the Parayana. It is time to understand that it is not a truth path. There is a quality to a path that it is superb when it comes to an integral. The most outstanding physics theory in the 20th century was Feynman's path integral. But in order to give a quality that one would not become confined by the path integral, Feynman devised for the first time a completely new language, a written language that could not be imaged in an integral way at all, could not be given a discourse. In integral-only language, he devised Feynman diagrams to illustrate, to express, to explore that the path integral is like a spinal column. It sets up the skeleton, but to flesh it out takes something more, and to give it the spirit, presence, it takes a whole lot more. Then you have to come away from the blackboard, and as Feynman did, went to his bongo drums to get in touch with the rhythm, that it is instantly, spontaneously present, and then becomes existentially parable, but the common denominator is that it's shareable like that music. It is an interesting thing. In the Zen tradition, the great transition from the 28 patriarchs of Indian Buddhism, who count among their patriarchs Ashvaghosha as being a later one, quite far into the 20s. Parshva is there also. And 2 patriarchs later, the great Nagarjuna, of whom we will talk much more about in extenso during this 2014 Parayana year. But when the 28th Indian patriarch went by sea in the 3rd century, the 300s, the 4th century AD, late 4th century, coming into China, his name was Bodhidharma. And Bodhidharma, there's a Chinese beautiful illustration by the great Qi Baishi. It has the 7 sages of China. 6 of them are in one area of the boat, and Bodhidharma, like somebody poisonous, is in the other end of the boat, because he was someone who was relentlessly real, would not indulge or participate with a bifurcated, paired world, even on the best of conditions, on any conditions. And he went to southern China with a trading, sailing group, landed in South China, and went as a recluse into a cave where he sat staring at a blank wall. That staring at a blank wall with this fierce eyes and bushy eyebrows and shaggy hair has become a characteristic ritual figure. In Japan, there are a couple of ritual figures. One is the cat with the raised paw that all businesses must have. One is the Jizo spirit that children's graves always have as a marker anywhere. And a third is Daruma. It is the fierce Bodhidharma that one has around to remind one that one has to do it this way. And in fact, the whole cult, and I repeat the word cult, the cult of Zazen, not Zazen itself, the cult of Zazen, that you can go to some kind of really comfortable retreat. Oh, some of them are really comfortable. And you can sit staring at a wall. Of course, you're paying for this privilege. It's like a rehab center, folks. And you have nice meals, you have nice clean place, nice people to talk to. Gee, we're all doing Zazen. Oh, we can sit on Zafus and, The second patriarch in China, Huiko, in order to get Bodhidharma's attention out of his formlessness, cut off one of his arms and presented it to Bodhidharma. And so Bodhidharma, looking at him, passed that formlessness to him so that it now could be passed, but it wasn't an it. And by the time it got to the fifth patriarch, Hong Jian, sometimes called Matsu in Japanese, he was old. He was in his early 70s. He knew he was going to pass on. He wanted to pass, and the way one passed the patriarchy was the bowl, which is like the grail, and the robe, which is like the unbroken robe after the crucifixion. The seamless robe, not just the empty bowl, but the empty bowl which receives what you need to live, not in duality, not in unity, but in formlessness, accepting whatever occurs. He was about to pass the bowl and the robe on to a very, very famous monk at the time, who in fact was sort of like the boss monk of the monastery, Shen Hui. While the Chan of Luoyang and Chang'an was enjoying this immense popularity and power, a then unknown priest in Nanyang, Shen Hui by name, was intent upon building a new school of his own. To this end, he launched an attack upon the Chan of Shen Hui's descendants, and after many years' struggle, eventually carried the day. The story of this new kind of Chan was unearthed by the late Dr. Hu Shi, who found among the Dunhuang documents housed at the Bibliothèque Nationale several manuscripts containing the sayings and writings of Shen Hui and his followers. These he collated and published, and through his studies rewrote the history of Chan during the Tang Dynasty. The career of Shen Hui fascinated this multifaceted scholar, who toward the close of his diversified life returned to the study of this champion of what became known as Southern Chan. Hence, Hu Shi's studies caught the imagination of both Western and Oriental scholars. A considerable body of material concerning Shen Hui has been produced. However, Shen Hui did not become the sixth patriarch. The kitchen boy became the sixth patriarch. His name was Hui Ning. On the eve before the passing of the robe and the bowl in the morning, late coming out of finishing off the pots and pans, Huineg read the haiku, the short form koan answering writing of Shen Hui, that by keeping polished the mirror in the mind, no dust will be able to collect upon it. And this was to be his triumphant acceptance of the sixth patriarchy and the triumph of Shen Hui. Underneath it scrawled Huineg, "There is no mirror, there is no mind. Where could dust collect?" Getting up early, Hung Jen Matsu read the scribbled, and he found out that the person who had written this was little Huineg, and he brought him in quietly to his quarters, gave him the robe and bowl, and said, "Now you better get out of town. They will be after you, because they're the power. They're the ones that control. The way that this situation is running, is run, will run. They're running because they know they're going to win. They've already won. They've got everything behind them." So Huineg left and surfaced later on. And this is the way in which in 713 AD, he was 73, he was going to pass on. Here's how the scribe describes what happened and what was said. Southern school, sudden doctrine, supreme Mahayana, great perfection of wisdom. The Platform Sutra, preached by the sixth patriarch Huineng at the Ta Fan temple in Shaozhou, one roll recorded by the spreader of the Dharma, the disciple Fa Hai, who at the same time received the precepts of formlessness. The master Huineg ascended the high seat at the lecture hall of the Ta Fan temple and expounded the Dharma of the great perfection of wisdom and transmitted the precepts of formlessness. At that time, over 10,000 monks, nuns, and lay persons sat before him. The prefect of Shaochu, Wei Che, some 30 officials from various departments, and some 30 Confucian scholars all begged the master to preach the Dharma of the great perfection of wisdom. The prefect then had the monk disciple Fa Hai record his words so they might become known to later generations and be of benefit to students of the way, in order that they might receive the pivot of the teaching and transmit them among themselves, taking these words for themselves. When we come next week, we'll see how at the same time that Huineg was doing this, in India, one of the great last Buddhist sages, Shantideva, was writing his classic, the Bodhikaryavitara, now translated as the Way of the Bodhisattvas. It originally was the Way of Enlightenment. More next week.